Okay, we are live. Assalamu alaikum everyone. Welcome to today's online conference titled Bio-Inspired Neural Networks, the Next Generation of AI. We are especially honored to welcome our speaker for today, Mr. Adjal Zakaria. So, Adjal Zakaria is a computer science engineering graduate specializing in intelligent systems and data science from EASY. Currently, he's a machine learning master student at UPCT, LLMs researcher at IRT Systems X. So, without further ado, Mr. Zakaria, the stage is yours.
Thank you. So, hello everyone. Well, you've done already the introduction. So, my name is Mehdi Zakaria Adjal. I'm a master student at L'Université de Paris-Cité, and I'm currently an intern at the research institution SystemX, working on large language models for time series data. I'll be presenting the topic of bio-inspired neural networks. More specifically, I'll be giving you like more of an overview of the field. So the question is, why biologically inspired knowledge? So why do we need the biological inspiration? The answer is pretty intuitive. I mean, when you think of the most important component in AI nowadays, which are neural networks and deep learning in general, their actual inspiration came from the actual biological neurons. So we took something that from neuroscience, we tried to model it mathematically and then code that in order to solve different AI tasks. But the thing is, uh, as research went into deep learning and as researchers worked on the different methods, neural networks diverge from their initial neuroscientific inspiration into more of a statistical computer sciencey way of doing things. For example, you get your usual transformers, CNNs, etc., which are really effective methods for solving relevant AI tasks. However, when it comes to their actual biological inspiration, there is little to no inspiration, especially, for example, for transformers. Unlike the beginnings of neural networks, etc., where we try to actually model how neurons work in a mathematical way. And that's actually the field of research of biologically inspired neural networks, where researchers are trying to bridge the gap between the current understanding or the current neuroscientific understanding of how our brain work, of how neurons actually behave, and AI methods that or the state of the art AI methods. So that's the field of bio-inspired neural networks. Now you got like different methods. For example, there are some researchers that try to take inspiration from biological organisms, not just humans. Like for example, the fruit fly, which mainly because like for the fruit fly, its brain is the most studied brain in biology, and we have literally a 3D model of all the neurons and their firing rates, etc. So some researchers tried to take inspiration from different biological systems to build new methods to solve different tasks in AI. Others took the other route. They took what already exists in AI and tried to make it more plausible, make it more similar to our understanding, our neuroscientific understanding of neurons. So these are what we call bioplausible learning methods, for example, which are methods that try to uh, replace, for example, your usual backpropagation. All right, why do we need biologically inspired neural networks? Well, there are multiple reasons. For example, one may think that the way to solve the problem of AGI is through a biological inspiration. So someone would say or hypothesize that if we had a perfect understanding of how our brain behaves, trying to mimic that would be the way to solve the AGI problem. But currently, what is being done is mainly motivated by these 3 points, which are reduced energy consumption. Neurons, for example, in the human brain only use or consume 20 watts of energy, unlike, for example, the smallest LLM that can be run in just one GPU, or one A100 GPU would use around 300 watts. of energy whilst solving just a single task, unlike our brain, which is multimodal and can solve multiple tasks. We have reduced parameters, reduced training duration. These are like sort of this is implied from having fewer parameters, reduced memory consumption, and having efficient and interpretable methods. So I'm gonna brush up some notions that are needed. So in order to study or to get into the field of biologically inspired neural networks, there is sort of like a wall that you need to jump over, which is the wall of the neuroscientific jargon. Because unlike the other subfields of AI, the bio-inspired neural nets research papers mainly use the neuroscientific jargon. For example, they call the connections between neurons, which we know as the weights, as synaptic connections. They call the activations membrane potential, and they speak a lot of about signals more than information, etc. So to brush up how the neurons or how neurons actually work is you have, like, for example, a presynaptic neuron. So the first neuron here, the moment that neuron builds up some energy potential that exceeds a certain threshold, it will fire a signal through the axon. And then that signal, upon reaching the synaptic connection between the presynaptic neuron, so the neuron here, and the postsynaptic neuron, if that connection is strong enough, uh, much of that energy of that or that signal would pass into the next neuron, and then similarly, if that neuron will build up a potential that is higher than the its threshold, it will also fire to the next, etc. Now, how does these neuron learn? So the learning is just strengthening or the weakening of these connections. For example, if two neurons are solving the same task, for example, their connection would be stronger, hence these signals will pass more fluidly. And that's actually what we are modeling in the current version of neural networks with the weights here. So the stronger or the higher the values of the weights, which are representing the synaptic connections between neurons or the connections between two neurons. So the higher that value is, the more of the information that comes from the input neuron to the output neuron, the more information of from the input neuron would pass to the output neuron, and etc. So, and how we actually model the learning. So, how do we strengthen the connection between two neurons? We do this through the backpropagation method, where given an objective function that would model or would be like your formalization of the task to solve, we would basically backpropagate that loss information or backpropagate the gradient information of that loss in order to update the connections using the gradient descent algorithm, for example. So what is there are actually some problems with backpropagation when it comes to the neuroscientific understanding of how neurons learn. So the way neurons learn, actually, first, what we know in neuroscience is that they only use local information. For example, in order to update the neurons here between the connection, sorry, here between the neuron alpha and the neuron beta, we would only use information that is local to those two neurons. Meaning, we could use the weights of the connections. We could use the output of this neuron, the output of this neuron. So we only keep it local. We cannot use information that comes from further away in the network in order to update these connections, which is something that we actually do in backpropagation. So in order to update the weights here, we could use the information from here. And that's actually the whole concept of the chain rule, etc. The second issue but that's what we call Hebbian learning or local learning. So neurons in the brain only use local information to update the strength of between the different neurons. And we have also the problem of weight transport. What do we mean by weight transport? Well, if you notice here, when doing backpropagation, if you take a look into the formulas, I will get to the formulas later, you will sort of be using, in order to pass the gradient information from a latter layer to the previous layer, you will use the transpose of those weights in order to backpropagate the gradient information. So in the formula, you will basically see the transpose of the weights. What this is implying is that we have, if we try to modelize this in an actual brain, for example, that would mean that we have connections between neuron A to neuron B, and then connections between neuron B to neuron A, that are used for one of them is used for the forward path, and the other one is used for the backward path. And we are assuming that those two connections are exactly the same in terms of strength, which is implausible. We cannot have this sort of guarantee in neuroscience that two connections are exactly the same in terms of strength. And that's the weight transport problem. So these are the main two issues in the current version of backpropagation when it comes to its biological plausibility, or its when it comes to the neuroscientific understanding of how neurons actually learn. Now, when we get to the existing works, so we can divide the works in biologically inspired neural networks into two main subfields, which are bio-inspired architectures and bioplausible learning methods. So bio-inspired architectures are like new architectures that try to take inspiration from the biological mechanisms or systems, like the fruit fly brains, for example, which will give us fruit fly methods, or like the SNNs or spiking neural networks, which some do actually call as the third generation of neural networks, which try to model the fact that actually neurons communicate in spikes of signals rather than continuous values. And we have bioplausible learning methods, which try to fix the bioplausibility issues that I talked about. So the weight transport problem and the Hebbian learning problem. So they try to fix those issues and propose new versions or replacements of backpropagation. So this will result in methods like feedback alignment, sign symmetry, which methods which we will get into their details later on. So let's start with the bio-inspired architectures. So most of the work that takes inspiration, for example, from the fruit fly brain, try to work on the problem of hashing, whether it's the hashing of sentences or images. So you will get like different methods, but the main idea is this. So you will have just one hidden layer, and you will basically get your vector that you want to hash here, pass it through that layer, and then simply use a winner take all mechanism to train your network. So the winner take all mechanism is actually a bio-inspired mechanism, which forces only few neurons to be trained for each, for example, for each example or for each sample in your data, which are and those neurons are the most activated one. So if we say, for example, only these two neurons are the ones with the highest activation given a certain input, only the weights connected to that neuron, to those neurons, are going to be changed. The others are going to be won't be changed, so they will be fixed. And that's the concept of the winner take all mechanism. And you can see this basically in the formula of how you actually would change the weights in fruit fly methods. So I won't delve into the details, but the main idea here is that first here you have the rank of the activation, so the multiplication between your input x and the weight of that hidden layer, and then you rank those neurons, and the G function will basically give one to, for example, the most activated, or the neuron with the highest activation, or the K highest. You can generalize this, multiplied. So this will output 1 for the neurons that we want to change their weights, and 0 for the others. And this will be multiplied by a certain value. But if you notice here, only local information is used. So only the information that we can find locally in the network, so between two layers, is actually used. So we are applying the concept that I talked about, the Hebbian learning concept, in order to train. So these methods are basically used for image hashing, token hashing, etc. And they are actually being tried. Some people are trying to actually apply this to vector databases and retrieval systems in different enterprises. Now, the second half of biologically inspired architectures are spiking neural networks, which, like I said, they try to mimic the fact that neurons in the brain actually use spikes in order to communicate. So these networks and how they work is simply so given certain input values that are continuous vectors, so your usual input vectors, they will try to encode first those values into spikes. You have different coding methods, but the simplest way you can think of in order to encode those values is via like having the frequency of the inputted spikes change based on how high or how low the values of different dimensions in your vectors are. And then those values are going to be passed into the next neuron, and then once a neuron achieves or gets gets a spike as an input, it will build up potential. And then say, for example, it got another spike, it will build up more potential. And then say, for example, for a while it didn't receive any spikes, so that potential will fade off. So that's the leaking part, will fade off. And the more spikes you get, the more potential you will build. And then upon reaching a certain threshold, that neuron will output a spike and then gets back to zero. And this keeps on going on. So so all the information is sort of encoded in the frequency of spikes in the different signals here, inputted to the neuron and outputted from this neuron to the other neurons. Now, most of the research here actually works on how do we train these networks. I mean, if you think of these spikes and say we try to train them in the normal backpropagation way, if we do so, we will encounter a certain issue, which is the fact that here we have spikes, which means that we have points that are not differentiable. So we cannot calculate gradients here. So hence we cannot apply backpropagation to train these networks. Yeah, by the way, these spikes are actually multiplied by weights here. So there are weights. The concept of weights still exists here. Now, like I said, most of the research is working on how to train these spiking neural networks. So one, for example, simple solution is, I forgot the name of the method, is STDP, I believe. Uh, uh, so the main idea of it is that I'm gonna make the connections between between a presynaptic neuron and a postsynaptic neuron higher if there was some correlation between the firing of this neuron and the firing of the latter neuron. What do I mean by this? Is that if, say, for example, the first neuron here or the presynaptic neuron fired a spike, and then shortly after, the neuron in the next layer that is connected to it also fired a spike. So we can assume that actually the firing of this presynaptic neuron caused the firing of this postsynaptic neuron. And if that difference in time is shorter than a certain threshold, so we use the shorter than a certain threshold, so we use basically the difference between the spike timings in order to strengthen or weaken the connections between these two neurons. So if the presynaptic neuron fired a spike and then shortly after the postsynaptic fired a spike, then we can assume that these connections are these neurons are actually solving the same problem or learning the same thing. So we're gonna strengthen. So this is the change in the weight. So we're gonna strengthen the connection or make the values of the weights higher. If, say, for example, the postsynaptic neuron fired first, then the presynaptic neuron fired. So there is no relation between the firings of these two neurons. So we're gonna make the weights weaker. Another solution is to actually take the loss with the non-differentiable points that are present here due to the spiking of networks, and then present a sort of surrogate function or a smoothing function that would smooth that loss, and then use that in order to train the weights using the usual backpropagation method. So that was the part of biologically inspired architectures. Now back to the bioplausible learning method, which, to remind you, are the methods that try to fix the problems that exist with backpropagation to solve the weight transport problem and the Hebbian learning problem. So we have different methods. For example, we have feedback alignment methods, we have sign symmetry methods, and sign symmetry methods can be further divided into uniform sign concordant feedbacks and fixed random magnitude sign concordant feedbacks, or FRSF for short. So to explain how they basically work, you remember in backpropagation we are using the transpose of the weights to backpropagate the gradient information through the network. What feedback alignment proposes to solve the weight transport issue is, instead of using the transpose of the weights, to actually use a random fixed matrix, which is here, which is the matrix B here, in order to backpropagate the gradient. And this matrix won't change throughout the network. Now you may think, okay, how does this work? Because we are sort of like introducing noise into our training. But the main idea is all about the fact that this matrix is fixed throughout the whole training, and people that did the researchers that did proposed this message sort of hypothesized that throughout the learning, the network will learn how to ignore this matrix right here, or ignore the noise in this matrix. Now, so in terms of the formula, so this is your usual backpropagation formula your usual backpropagation formula. So if you notice here, the usage of the weight transport, the transpose of the weight from the first layer or the second, etc., will be replaced by different randomly initialized matrices that are fixed throughout the training. And that's the main idea of feedback alignment methods. Now, the issue with these methods is that in terms of results, they actually do not scale. So they work pretty good with shallow networks. So they perform relatively good in different tasks. However, the deeper your network gets, the more issues you're gonna have. I mean, for once, like in a task, we used these networks and they sometimes even achieved like near 0% accuracy in image classification, etc. So what's the solution of this? So if we say that backpropagation is using 100% weight transport, so 100% of the weights information from the forward pass is being used to backpropagate the gradient. So that's backpropagation. And if we say that feedback alignment is using zero weight transport, so 0% of the information from the forward synaptic connections or forward pass weights are being used to backpropagate the gradient information. So you will have sign symmetry methods that try to sort of strike a balance between performance and weight transport, the amount of weight transport being used. So to start, for example, we have uniform sign concordant feedbacks, which they take simply the weights that were supposed to be used in the backpropagation method. So your transpose of the forward weights, and they use the sign of that in order to of that matrix in order to backpropagate the gradient information. And you have fixed random magnitude sign concordant feedbacks that tries to improve upon USF by simply multiplying a random matrix with this is a pointwise multiplication. So we multiply a random matrix with the signs of the weights to sort of introduce these random magnitudes here that are gonna help with the training of the network. So sign symmetry methods sort of hypothesize that we don't actually need precise weight transport. What we actually need is the signs of the different weights in order to achieve good performance. And actually, in terms of performance, they are relatively similar to backpropagation in terms of performance in different tasks like image classification, etc. However, they do not reach like 100% of the performance of backpropagation. And what we tried to do in last year during our final year's project is to try to sort of assess the effectiveness of sign symmetry methods or sign symmetry learning rules in terms of fine-tuning, because most of the research was heavily focused on the pre-training part. So what if we used backpropagation to pre-train networks, and then used sign symmetry methods to fine-tune those networks to different downstream tasks? And that's what we actually did in a paper. The preprint is available on arXiv. And what we noticed is that sign symmetry methods, when used just for fine-tuning instead of pre-training, actually achieve similar, if not slightly greater, performance to backpropagation, whilst improving on a really important aspect, which is adversarial robustness. So robustness to adversarial attacks. So the paper is available on arXiv. And that was my presentation. Thank you for your attention. And as a bonus, there is actually summer school on information retrieval that will be on Wolverhampton, UK. So you can check their website. And if you're interested in information retrieval, which is a pretty hot topic nowadays, due to the use of your different rankers, RAGs, etc., RAG systems. So take a look into their website if this interests you. So thank you. And if you have any questions, feel free to scan this barcode. You will have my socials there. Thank you.
Okay, perfect. Thank you very much, Zakaria, for your detailed presentation, as it gave us like a thorough view on the field, on the existing work from like those bio-inspired architectures to bioplausible learning methods. So we're gonna take a couple of questions before we end our conference. Um, the first question comes from Kamal. You mentioned that bio-inspired neural networks are used in deep hashing methods. Can you elaborate more on their utility?
Yeah. So actually, their utility is mainly in terms of interpretability. For example, if you take a look at, I think the method's name is flyhash. So there is like a demo website there where, when using Fruitfly inspired networks, they actually achieved better interpretability. For example, you would have different dimensions in the learned hashes representing actually different aspects in like English. Say, for example, if you use the word like team, you will have like a dimension that represents a group of people having being activated, and dimensions that represent topics that are unrelated to the things that the token is presenting, having like an activation of 0.
Thank you. So the next, okay, another question from Kamal. Were other brains studied? Were other brains studied than Fruitfly, and why it was used for simplicity?
Were other brains studied for other than Fruitfly? Uh, I think yes. I mean, some even like worked on the human brain mainly, and for example, the dopamine part of things in more of an RL fashion to train networks. But there was a lot of focus on the brain, due to the fact that in biology, it's the most understood system. And why it was used? It was used, yeah, for mainly the fact that it's actually simple, and the fact that, for example, using small amount of neurons, fruit flies are actually able to effectively map different modalities like odors and from the olfactory system, colors, etc., to detect danger or the presence of food, etc. So that's why they were mainly used.
Thank you. Next question comes from me, and it says, We have strong mathematical grounding for classical deep learning methods, for instance, backprop. But for like those, like for instance, backpropagation formulas, like they are mathematically intuitive. But for bio-inspired NS, are they like derived rigorously from biological studies or more of heuristics, experimental in nature? As we see, like lots of equations, for instance, bio-plausible learning methods.
So most of the works are more heuristic and experimental, though they have a rigorous inspiration. I mean, there are like neuroscientific mathematical modelings of how neurons actually behave using like different dynamic systems, etc. And the works try to take that and sort of build heuristic methods on top of it, or to sort of simulate that behavior.
Okay, thank you. So
Now,
next question.
in terms of proof of convergence, for example, I did not see any proofs of convergence.
For my opinion, I think it would be like it's very tied to neuroscience. So I believe from mathematical like basis, I believe that it is not based much more on math, yet for based more on those studies done in neuroscience. Yeah, and
Yeah,
like I believe,
for
yeah,
example, if you take like the classical neural networks, if I talk about the how they modeled the neurons, so their modeling was really not rigorous at all. They basically assumed first continuity in information, whereas actual neurons they use spikes. So you see, so when trying to build methods, most of researchers don't focus on rigorousness in terms of modelization, but rather effectiveness. At least that's how things are done nowadays.
okay. Next question comes from Kamal. Well, not this one. How much of biology did you get into to work comfortably with bio neural networks?
I mean, at first, like it was pretty rough because the jargon is different. So the moment you sort of understand the different words used, like when we say synaptic connections, when we say presynaptic neuron, postsynaptic neuron, Hebbian learning, etc. Once you get uh, uh, more comfortable with those terms, you can delve into biologically inspired research pretty comfortably, I guess. Because like there are some researchers that try to use computer science to explain or to try to understand more how actual neurons work, and there are researchers that do like the opposite way. So they try to use the neuroscientific understanding to further advance research in AI.
Nice. Next question comes from me. Are there existing frameworks or libraries tailored for building and experimenting with bio-inspired NLs? But maybe, for instance, like based on PyTorch.
Yes, there is, for example, BioTorch, which implements replacements for backpropagation. I don't know if it's well maintained or no, because I mean it was introduced in a paper, but we used it. It was pretty good. It implements like your feedback alignment methods, sign symmetry methods, etc. There are also libraries that simulate spiking neural networks. However, in order to sort of get the most of spiking neural networks, I mean, you can simulate them to build methods, but you won't get the benefits of spiking neural networks until you use a neuromorphic, for example, hardware. Because the main or one of the main benefits of spiking neural networks is the fact that we can pair them with neuromorphic hardware, where once, like for example, you have a spike, unless you have a spike, your neurons are actually shut down, so there is no energy used. Hence, you will get the energy efficiency. But you can still use these methods to sort of simulate spiking neural networks to further advance the research, etc.
Yeah, and I believe in the first or the second conference we had Mehdi bin Sheikh. He
Okay.
talked about
Yeah.
Spinnaker. Yeah, he talked about Spinnaker too. He said there aren't like platforms that that host those hardware tailored for neuromorphic computing. But he said maybe the company which he works, they may like open some chances for people to experiment with such hardware like in the near future.
Yep.
Uh, uh, Maybe we take one more question by Kamal again. It says, we see now that there is a far advancement in AI using CNN's attention. How bio and NN would catch, as you mentioned, that current AI technologies kind of diverged from the biological intuition.
I didn't understand the question. How bio would catch that current technology kind of diverge? So how would it catch on to the performance, you mean? If you can further elaborate, Kamal. Yeah.
Yeah,
So
exactly.
yeah. So how do researchers go about such thing? Is via using the route of so the other route instead of fully being biologically inspired. So taking an inspiration from a biological mechanism and going from there, they go the opposite way. So they take those methods like your usual transformers, CNNs, etc., and they try to make them more biologically plausible, and then see the benefit of that. So if there was benefits, then good. If there was none, then it was not like a good route, for example. I mean, for CNNs, for example, they had an issue in terms of biological plausibility, which was the weight sharing concept. So, in CNNs, the main innovation there was the fact that we are using the same kernel weights and just sort of sliding those kernels through the image in order to reduce the number of weights being trained, and that was actually beneficial to different image downstream tasks. And what they do, for example, in biologically inspired neural nets, is they try to take that weight sharing concept, which is not plausible, and they try to fix it, or they try to find a biological way of doing it and see how good would it be.
Okay. I believe that was last question. So thank you very much, Mehdi,
Thank
for
you.
your great presentation. It was very enlightening and very informative, and it's our pleasure to have you. It was our pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you.
Thank you
The
for
pleasure is mine.
accepting our Thank you
The
for
pleasure is
accepting
mine.
our invitation. Thank you. Okay, and thank you everyone for coming to today's conference. See you tomorrow, inshallah, for another exciting topic.